One of the most influential and powerful men in Cuba. His name is Fidel Castro. From Prime Minister of Cuba to President, Castro led Cuba through an ideology that brought one of the greatest social movements in society, communism. Educated in the University in Havana in law, he studied and became heavily involved in politics. He was involved in political groups to help the poor, and then later joined the Ortodoxo Party of Cuba in 1951.
Nobody really knows anything about Castro. It's taboo.
During his studies, Castro came by a copy of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. He felt baffled by Marx's ideology, the analytical approach to the class struggle, the criticism of capitalism, and how people can live in harmony without religion.
Copy of the Communist Manifesto, the famous Communist Manifesto, fell into my hands and I read some things I'll never forget. What phrases, what truths, and we saw these truths every day.
Fidel Castro was the political nemesis of Fulgencio Batista. Starting out as a member of the army, Batista played a large role in the Surgents' Revolt in 1933, which was the overthrow of President Eduardo Machado, and gained role of Army's Chief of Staff a year later. Batista was then elected President of Cuba in 1940. In the 1944 election, Carlos Prio won the role of president. Yet, Batista's fall from power was only temporary. In the 1952 elections, with the help of the military, he led a coup, overthrowing Carlos Prio, gaining the power himself by force, and becoming dictator of Cuba. Batista would never tolerate another fall from his power. He went against the Cuban Constitution, so if there are any more elections, his victory will be guaranteed for sure. Under Batista's rule, people had a poor education system and a very poor healthcare system as well.
Batista was a dictator. The education in Cuba is like in many of these Latin American countries. It was not available for everybody if everybody were willing to get an education. The elementary and middle school was free, but for high school people got to pay. It was not a lot, but it was not affordable for everybody. Then education was not at its best in Cuba, and healthcare was not its best either.
During his rule, the gap between rich and poor was very large, meaning most of the people were in poverty. Batista started to give incentives to people to open large gambling casinos. He also took bribes and let the United States Mafia continue their business, in return of monetary gain. Batista, other politicians and company owners were the only ones living in wealth throughout the country, while the economy was suffering. In this change, the crime and prostitution rate was at its highest. All of these changes under Batista were the truths, as seen by Fidel Castro in the Communist Manifesto. While a majority of the population was getting poorer, the few were getting richer. Castro was reminded of the Communist Manifesto during this time. These changes were more of the truths he read. Castro was seeing capitalism the same way Karl Marx was. He felt that the way Batista was running Cuba was not only a dictatorship, but a game for him and the bourgeoisie party to keep getting richer, while the rest get poorer. According to Karl Marx, this is what capitalism would bring to a nation. In 1957, Castro, along with his organization called the July 26 Movement, sought to take over, for Castro to rule the nation himself. The plan was to overthrow Batista by attacking the Moncada army barracks. The plan, of course, was a complete failure, with most of the rebels murdered. Castro was only lucky to be alive. The lieutenant was ordered to execute him, but ignored the orders and put him in the nearest prison instead. 2 years later, Batista made a mistake that would affect his whole political career and Cuba's whole future. Pressure from Castro's supporter led Batista to release him. Castro and the rest of the rebels left to Mexico to plan another attack. A year later, determined for change and more armed than ever before, the rebels planned to make base in the Sierra Mountains. They were attacked on the way. When they finally got to the mountain, even with just a few men, Castro and his rebels raided every army post in sight, building up their stock of weapons, and soon took over the whole territory. Batista had no choice but to flee the nation, leaving Castro to rule.
There was a hope for the Cuban people for things to get better, and Fidel took advantage of this situation. There was a lot of American inversionists and American business in Cuba, and Cuban people were not very happy with that. Cuban people with money want the Americans out. Fidel was promising something like that. Fidel was promising a better education system, Fidel was promising a better healthcare system, and he was not promising communist. When he took power, people were eager for a change for the better. So before he got into the government, he told the people of Cuba what the people wanted to hear: a good change. Change in education, change, in the law of the land. He wanted to distribute the land to the workers, the farmers, and people welcomed that idea. It was kind of socialism, but not communism.
Because it does sound a lot like communism.
It did. In the beginning, it didn't sound. Some people, they saw that, and they left Cuba immediately, and they left behind everything that they had.
So at the time, like, the people, when he was making those changes, the people thought they weren't expecting communism at the time.
Some people, they were expecting communists.
Right.
They saw that coming, and they left.
Right.
And they left immediately. Some people with money left and took everything with them.
Making it hard to expect communism in the government, Castro himself was not a full open communist, although did have mostly socialist aspects. Castro started his governments being as good as his word. One of the first planned changes was the education system. Keeping in mind the high population of illiteracy in Cuba, Castro's first promise was to wipe out illiteracy in the nation.
Cuba would be the first country in America that in a few months time will be able to say that it does not have a single illiterate person.
He launched the Great Campaign of Literacy in 1961, and it resulted in a massive success, as he proudly announced what he called 4 centuries of ignorance. As part of Castro's slightly socialist aspects, he of course had other changes planned in the education system. In the new education system, every class taken by students involved politics. The education system was changed in a way that people couldn't study whatever they wanted, but only whatever supported the revolution. Everything had to have a political significance and intention. In this new education system, everything was controlled by the government. There was a cult of personality that was supporting Fidel Castro. No matter what you were studying, people were told that the best thing to study was anything related to communism.
By God to build a house of peace where people will pray, and they will come on every lean camel and out of every ravine for the purpose of praising Allah, to glorify Allah. Mountains of Mecca, what can you tell of the day that stones from the sky fell, destroying an army determined to break?
As well as the education system, there was a cult of personality in the media. No one was allowed to advertise anything unless it was related to government. Everything in the media was either ideological or had to do with Castro. All that was heard was controlled by the government. Everything supported the government, and only what the government wanted people to hear was heard. Another one of Castro's movements was how he dealt with the horrible healthcare system. Focusing on the high amount of people in poverty, he increased the life expectancy by investing in doctors, hospitals, and other medical services. Perhaps one of Castro's more noticeable medical successes was wiping out the Dengue plague.